Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. On today's episode, my conversation with Dr. Ian Myles. Dr. Myles is the principal investigator at an NIH lab studying eczema. Specifically, he focuses on the role of environmental contaminants and their complex interactions with the skin microbiome and the immune system. Dr. Myles is a trained allergist and immunologist, and he deeply understands the overlaps between the immune system and the nervous system. In this episode, we discuss the allergic triad: eczema, allergies, and asthma. We also cover his new book, Gattaca Has Fallen, which is a sharp critique of the field of population genetics research. Dr. Myles writes at length about the field and all of the many problems with this type of research, including things like a lack of basic control, as well as just how much money has been spent and possibly wasted on this type of research. It's a wonderful book that I totally recommend. It's both very conversational in tone while also being quite scientific and honestly very funny. Dr. Myles is a great conversationalist, and he was incredibly generous with both his knowledge and his time. So please sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dr. Ian Myles. Dr. Myles, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I am so thrilled to have you here. I did mention you quite a bit in a previous episode, so hopefully our listeners are very excited to get to know you and learn a lot more about the work that you do. In my true style, I would love to kind of start by going way back and asking you, what did you want to be when you grew up as a kid, and what led you to become a medical doctor?
Well, I think earliest on I was going to be a football player, and the complete lack of athleticism and skill and desire to get hit kind of killed that. But after that, I got into science, I think, under the idea of people shouldn't have to die. We should, be able to live forever. I was really young. I thought, my dad at least was like, doctors don't prevent people from dying, but at least you can make them feel better. And so kind of got intrigued with that. And then in elementary school, high school, all that was just kind of good at science, I suppose. That made more sense to me. Wasn't so strong in English or spelling or any of the liberal arts type of endeavors. And so just kind of slowly gravitated towards med school, I think.
Just felt that pull.
I guess so.
Felt the pull right to med school.
Yeah, med school, I thought I was going to go do neurology. Actually, my plan was to work on the spinal cord regeneration for people in accidents. In med school, I didn't really love neurology, the clinical aspects. The research was still fascinating. But I got really intrigued by the immune system in med school. And looking back, they're the two most similar organ systems, I would think. The only systems that can learn, the only systems that mature, the only systems that can tell you from the outside world, that can have trauma inflicted on it that lasts, a lifetime, those kinds of things. And so very intrigued with the immune system. And then that led me to kind of the way the training system works is allergy/immunology. So I would probably consider myself more immunology focused. But now our research is, gravitated towards eczema and other allergic diseases.
Right. And it's interesting that you went from neurology to immunology because, as you mentioned, they have a lot of similarities, including they share compounds, right? Things like histamine that the average person thinks about as an immunological or allergic factor is also a neurotransmitter. And there is this kind of evolving, growing, exploding in some ways field of neuroimmunology that's really, really big right now. So you're kind of poised to really understand that intersection.
Yeah, I hope so. There was a former mentor, Bob Mumford, and he talks all the time about every neuron in your body, every nerve has the same receptors as the immune cells. And if you think that that's by accident, you're kind of foolish. And what is limited it has been the methods. That it's hard to study nerves, and it's nearly impossible to study nerve complexes. They're interfacing with each other, even the most basic interactions, let alone the brain. And so we are getting better. But I definitely think that there's a dramatic overlap in function that is not yet appreciated.
Yeah, I agree. And I will hold myself back from going too deep and spinning out too long on this particular topic because it is so personally fascinating to me. And I think, you know, as you just quoted your mentor in saying, when we look in the body and we notice that two cells have the same receptors or that one compound or one gene unlocks 10 functions,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so much to get curious about there. And I will come back to that word curiosity because it does play an important role in your book as well. But speaking of curiosity and sort of taking a little bit of a journey through life, you, in addition to having an MD, also have an MPH. So I'm curious because this podcast does focus on many critical public health topics. What led you to want to pursue an MPH and what did you focus on during those studies?
Yeah. I mean, initially I hadn't thought much about it. So I'd already had my MD. I was working at NIH and then I joined the Commission Corps. And so then within that, there's this expectation that you will get a better understanding of the public health service. So for those that don't know, the U.S. Commission Corps is kind of underneath the Surgeon General. So we dress like the Navy, but we respond to public health emergencies and not, warfare. And so I thought, I wanted to learn more about kind of what the academic understanding of public health was and really focus on policy. A lot of my particular program ended up being about like messaging and how you would frame different public health arguments or campaigns. And then my write-up, my thesis, whatever you want to call it, was focused on how well the academic literature communicated the Ebola information during the height of that particular outbreak. Because we saw something very similar. When the second Ebola hit, you see this rush of publications get to the literature. And it was a little more stark there because there was like 4 people in the world who were Ebola specialists. So you're kind of wondering, how does 500 people suddenly have an Ebola project ready for publication? And I wanted to kind of dissect how good or bad it was at communicating information. And I'd say the literature did not do nearly as well as I had hoped. I didn't ever go back to do COVID to see. I'm sure it wasn't any better.
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, I can't imagine it's any better. But that's kind of what I did for my MPH.
That's so interesting. And especially, I mean, obviously you mentioned COVID and you work in a field that researches like other sort of common public health, chronic health issues. Just thinking about the way as doctors, researchers, and public health institutions, these issues are communicated about with the public. I mean, the number of problems there, we could go on and on, right? Like when we talk about problems in the health sector, there's obviously like issues with how we think about health problems. There's issues with access to healthcare. There's issues with quality of healthcare once you can access it. But one of the biggest issues is communication.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that break down so supremely during the pandemic where maybe because they were afraid to sound uncertain, certain things were communicated too quickly and then not quickly enough. And this creates this tension and then this distrust on the side of the public. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, because you did study communication and public health things within your MPH, like, is there kind of a big picture way that as health institutions, you think things could or should shift to better and maybe more comprehensively or more compassionately communicate complex health topics to the general public?
Yeah, I think the biggest breakdown, and this was the Ebola pandemic, and it just repeated itself perfectly for COVID, is most people just want to know, what am I supposed to do with this information? And there is a danger, particularly if you're a public health official, of coming off paternalistic or, telling people, oh, well, this is what you have to do, just follow our orders blindly kind of thing. And there's obviously people who communicate it in that fashion. But it's completely reasonable to say what you are supposed to do with this information is nothing. Just wait.
Mm-hmm.
We need to collect more information. We need to collect more data. You don't have to do anything different right now. And it came up with the Ebola one. There was actually a New York Times reporter who I thought did an excellent job. And one of the titles was, "You cannot catch Ebola from a bowling ball," because there was somebody in New York who went bowling and then 3 days later was diagnosed with Ebola, and it was like, oh my gosh, is everybody in the bowling alley going to get sick? And you're like, no, they're not. You don't need to worry about this. And I think it's fine to start communicating that, because otherwise you get into like all these like nitpicky details, and I get it for an academic conversation, and people who desire extra information like that, who want all those details, will find it. I mean, the internet exists now, right? But just say like, what are you going to do with this information? How is this useful to us? And I think that people would be appreciative of that, particularly as long as it came with, right now we don't do anything different, because this information is not like, you see in somebody does a study and it's in a mouse. You're like, well, nothing. You don't do anything yet. Wait for the clinical trial. Wait for the safety data to come back. Something like that, right? That kind of being clear about your uncertainty rather than constantly hemming and hawing. I think people don't take well to that. And then especially when you juxtapose it with the charlatans, who are always very definitive in their conversation, that's a problem.
Yeah, that is, there's some kind of like quote that's like, the truth is quiet and lies are loud, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a lot easier to come out really loud and really fast with something totally baseless when you're actually trying to develop a body of evidence to get to somewhere closer to certainty. And you say to the general public, like, well, 10 studies sort of suggest that XYZ might be beneficial, but we're waiting on results from this, randomized controlled trial with this isolated compound. So like, come back to us in 5 more years. And then someone across the internet is like, just drink celery juice.
Right.
That's it. It's very easy. People can just go buy celery. Like they don't have to wait 5 years. They don't have to wonder. So there is like this issue, I think, in science in general, and of course in public health communication, where the truth is messy.
Yeah.
And the not really truth is so clean and so simple. And people really crave that, especially in times of chaos.
Right.
You tell somebody it's a pandemic, their nervous system and immune system both go right on red alert, and they just want something simple to calm them down. So that's a tension in the public health space, I think, that we have not really adequately addressed.
Right. And you have to also balance, like, I get why you don't want to tell anybody go drink celery juice based on one study and whatever, right? But at the same time, like, you could also communicate to people, the risk is probably low.
Right.
You're probably not going to get hurt. The most likely outcome is you're going to waste your money.
Right.
But if it works for you, great.
Yeah.
Write it up. Tell us. If something bad happens, write it up. Tell us. But, it's fine. Versus if somebody wants to drink Tide, you'd be like, nope. The data is, the overwhelming majority of data says that's a terrible idea. You're going to get hurt. It's not, don't do that.
Yeah.
Right? And then if future studies tell us somehow something else, fine, we'll revisit it. But I think you could still communicate to people clearly, like, all right, fine, you want to try something or not.
I want to focus on this for a second, because I love what you're saying, because I think that, to try to repeat back to you, to paraphrase what I think you just said, there are a lot of quote unquote not scientifically supported health practices or wellness practices that probably don't confer much risk. And the major issue with them is that there may be a waste of time or a waste of money, but otherwise are pretty benign. And yet I do feel like health professionals, doctors, scientists spend a lot of time on the internet, playing ping pong with these claims and kind of wasting their breath about what's not scientifically founded, as opposed to maybe just letting those go, taking a deep breath and going, if people want to drink celery juice, which, by the way, it's delicious if you mix it with lemon juice. I'm not a pure celery girl, but a lemon celery, very refreshing. Lots of minerals. But if we focused instead on, like you're saying, letting that just be noise and going, drink a little celery juice, what's the big deal? And then only really spending the time to come out against claims like drinking bleach, right? Like really focusing on what's the cost-benefit analysis of once again sounding the alarm. Hey, vitamin C probably won't cure everything, right? I mean, yeah, but like if people spend $5 on vitamin C and nothing really bad happens, should we maybe save those like rallying cries for the more critical things?
Right. Or just more general. Because first off, there's never been a placebo-controlled trial for vitamin C and scurvy. Right. So not everything has rigid phase 3 FDA approved evidence behind it.
Right.
But within that, you could focus more on if somebody wants to take some supplement, just giving the general caution. Look, you got to assure that it actually has what it says that it has, because you don't want to invest all your emotions and energy and time to take a supplement because the bottle says it has whatever, and inside it's just nothing but sawdust, right?
Right.
Or worse, inside it's got a lot of lead or cadmium or some other kind of contaminants. So you got to do that kind of research to say, like, as long as it's not contaminated and it's genuinely what it claims, yeah, this is the reason to be concerned or not, go for it. Right. And I definitely agree. I think we spend so much effort, yelling at people that like, oh, that vitamin's not gone through a rigorous, clinical trial. It's like, well, is it hurting? Like, let them try it and they'll
Right.
be disappointed. If you really believe it's useless,
Right.
eventually they'll come to that same conclusion and then they'll come back to talk about something else. But if you browbeat them ahead of time, they're gonna be like, well, this guy's not open-minded, or he's not willing to, he doesn't understand that I'm suffering now. And so I don't feel like waiting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years for you guys to get your FDA approved drug and then cross my fingers that my insurance covers it and hope that maybe it'll be a benefit to me and won't have caused harm along the way, right? Like, I need something
Right.
now and I'm just going to try this as a flyer. Yeah, whatever.
I think the same is true for dietary changes. I
Right.
think that these days there's a lot of tension. And of course, this field is rapidly changing, and the food as medicine conversation is getting a lot more traction right now, which is super exciting. But, for the last many, many years and or decades, people would go to their doctor and say, I'm not feeling well. I have this condition. Do you think I should change my diet? And the doctor would say to them, no. Diet plays no role in this. It's entirely genetic, or it's entirely just you have this, I don't know, condition and you can't cure it and diet won't help. You just have to take this drug. But then so many people went ahead and changed their diets anyway and did experience a benefit
Mm-hmm.
that undermined their faith in everything their doctor was saying. So I think like similarly, and part of this goes just back to medical education, and I haven't been through med school, you have, so maybe you can speak to this, but the narrative in the food as medicine space is like, right now doctors don't get more than 1 semester of basic nutrition. They don't actually know how diet impacts health outcomes, and we don't have dietitians in every medical office, and there's like a shortage of dietitians, and even dietitians are sponsored by a lot of companies that maybe are influencing their opinions on food and nutrition. So putting that political thing aside, that hot potato, it's like, how many different ways have we undermined health communication in this country by just saying no when the real answer was, I don't know?
Yeah, I think I'd be shocked if most med schools gave 1 semester of nutrition. I would be more along the lines of 1 lecture. It's not integrated into biochemistry. We do all these conversations about, I distinctly remember being able to diagram like the acid reflux receptors and all the different things, but couldn't tell you one bit as to which foods are more likely to induce those compounds that then would be, like generally, well, spicy foods, you're going to upset your stomach more than not, but you didn't get that in med school. Like, we don't
Right.
talk about that at all. And yeah, I think, you see it a lot with kind of the anti-gluten. And so I think my stance on that is it's not well researched outside of genuine, pure celiac, testable celiac disease. For everybody else, it's not well researched. You don't have a mountain of evidence saying it's overblown, or you don't, it's fine, these people are Looney Tunes. You don't have a mountain of evidence saying it's great and wonderful, and if you avoid it, all glory will come to your colon. We don't know. And so if you would like to try it, other than the fact that you just have to be careful because sometimes gluten-free products put so much sugar in it to make them palatable,
Yeah.
as long as you keep a mind on that, if you want to try it, I don't see the harm. Just go into it knowing that this is a trial, right?
Yeah.
This is an experiment. You're going to give it a shot. There's very low downside. And to even just say like, this is the best we know, right? Even to say like, well, this is what I do know, and it's not very much, so give it a shot. And I think we're very insulting about those kinds of mindsets and behaviors. And that, I just think, continues to distance us from the patients, so that when we try to have a conversation about the things we genuinely do know about, they're like, well, you're the guy who told me that dietary changes weren't going to help me, and I feel great.
Right.
after having done a few dietary changes. So what do you know?
Right.
And then it's easy to blow us off when we're genuinely like, please stop coughing on each other in the subway.
Right,
Like,
exactly. It's like we really undermine these basic abilities to communicate because there's this divide that's been caused by a lack of trust. I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I was obese when I was a kid, and I would go to the pediatrician, and here I am. I'm a kid. I'm eating food that tastes good. I have friends who are normal weight and they're eating more junk food than I am in front of me. Like objectively, like I feel like I had fewer Pop-Tarts in my diet than many of my skinny, skinny friends. And I go to the pediatrician and he would just look at me and say really helpful things like, eat less, move more. And I'm like 10. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Right? Like, and he once said something like, buy a jump rope and just jump rope. For what, hours? I mean, there was no prescription. There was nothing. There was no referral to a dietitian. There was no referral to a trainer. Nothing. It was just these platitudes. And that is like the foundation of my sort of seeking alternative health things and becoming curious about public health and these trends with chronic illness, because I wasn't alone in being an obese kid. Those trends were growing, and it wasn't just as simple as eat less, move more. And even if it were that simple, who was helping me do that?
Right.
Where was your referral to a dietitian to look at what I was eating? Because I'm a little kid. I put a peanut butter sandwich in my lunch and I have it for lunch. Like, it is what it is. I don't have like a expense account. I'm not like going out for steak dinners every night. Like, what do you think? So anyway, personal rant about the breakdown in the healthcare system. But also quickly, I'm wondering, we're talking about how right now there's really no nutrition education in medical school. But due to how rapidly the field of microbiome research, which we will come to very soon, is changing and evolving, and how important those microbe-nutrient interactions are proving to be, maybe it's a benefit that we're going kind of tabula rasa on nutrition education for doctors, because maybe we can come right out of the gate with, just so you know, it's actually a complex biochemical reaction, and diet can influence GLP-1 agonist production in the gut, and it can influence metabolic syndrome. And like, is it maybe a good thing that we're starting with nothing?
I don't know. I think it is. I think doctors and the medical community writ large require some kind of molecular mechanism to explain a phenomenon before they'll genuinely accept it. So the idea of like, eat fruits and vegetables, like that sounds like, oh, that's cute advice, that's fine, but that's not going to make it into our lectures because we don't have like, I do realize that like if you are a dietitian, you've taken those classes that genuinely break down like why does that work, but you spent years on that, and if in a lecture or in a semester, like that's not going to happen. I'm chuckling because my wife's actually a registered dietitian, and
cool.
I came back from this lecture one time, and they did this great study. They were trying to figure out why kids overseas were having failure to thrive in parts of the world where malnourishment was large. So they do this microbiome study, and they like break down like, all right, what are the microbes in the kids that are doing well versus the kids that are not doing well, not growing well? What do those microbes need to eat? And so let's make sure that we feed a probiotic or prebiotic diet that will foster the growth of the organisms that help kids grow and be healthy and strong, right? And it came away with like chickpeas and kale and vegetables and fruit or whatever. And I'm telling my wife, because like, this is so fascinating. They like figured out the perfect diet using the microbiome. And she's like, so plant-based proteins, fruits and vegetables, like congrats. Like how many millions of dollars did it take you guys to figure that out? And so I think, if anything, I do think the microbiome will put that foot in the door to now you can say like, wait, you can't have a conversation about GI disease that doesn't involve a conversation about fiber and the microbiome now. And so hopefully then, now that we have a mechanism, maybe people will pay more attention to it.
Tell that to the biologics manufacturers. They are more than happy to have that conversation without any discussion.
True.
It's those are very interesting drugs. Very fascinating. But I do agree with you that hopefully this microbiome world kind of brings like hardcore scientists and food people together. And of
Mhm.
course, there are hardcore science food people. Shout out to your wife.
Sure.
I love the immunologist and the dietitian
Right, yeah.
married. That's a match made in heaven. Total power couple vibes. Do you guys just like sit up all night reading literature to each other?
No, she works on, she's also at NIH, so works on usually inborn errors of metabolism. So kids with like
PKU.
monogenetic disorders that they just can't eat certain things, MMA, those kinds of disorders
Wow.
that I don't interface with.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Things that are actually impacted by genetics.
Correct. True diseases that you can actually find a gene for, trace
Yes.
heritability, find a mechanism, and use gene therapy for treatment. Absolutely.
Yes.
Those are legit.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And that's another hint because we're getting closer and closer to discussing the book. But first, you right now study eczema
Mhm.
And microbiome eczema and chemical eczema, environmental factors in eczema. So I would love to hear you. And I, by the way, have had eczema, and so has one of my daughters. So personal lived experience here. I would love to hear you speak about eczema in general, if you want to just give like a basic definition for the audience. And then what do you think the average person maybe doesn't understand about eczema that you do understand?
Yeah, so I'd say, in general, eczema is an umbrella category. We work on the fancy term would be atopic dermatitis. But so eczema, atopic dermatitis is the most prominent one of the eczemas, most frequent. So it's a itch disease where they get rash, bad itch, and then that itch typically keeps people awake and causes sleep disturbance. It puts kids who have eczema are at risk for food allergies, allergic rhinitis, or hay fever, and asthma. And I think kind of there's two halves, like the things that people get wrong if they've never experienced eczema and don't have a kid or don't know anybody with it is they think, oh, it's just a rash, right? And they don't fully appreciate the sleep disruption and the distraction, like in class, and sometimes the bullying from like, oh, your skin, and they don't want to sit near you because they think they're going to catch something from you. I don't think they appreciate the impact that it has on kids' life, and that the parents can have that sense of frustration and hopelessness, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I'm doing everything and the kid's disease is still manifesting. But I think what the average researcher probably gets wrong is this assumption that it's this innate property, that if you said one of your children has eczema, the assumption is, well, he or she just lost the genetic lottery, right? They just, well, that one was unlucky. Sorry, some kids just get eczema and the other two didn't. They got lucky, right? And not like at all this appreciation that the data does not support that mindset at all. And that there is clearly something driving up the rates of this disease that people have not been appreciating.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that something could be quote unquote genetic, but how many of our grandparents
Exactly.
had eczema or even allergies?
Mhm.
Actually, my grandpa did have some seasonal allergies,
Mhm.
but aside from that, it
But
was
if
certainly.
you go, that there's a little uptick in seasonal allergies around the 30s.
Yeah.
And then from there it can goes up. But if you go to your great-great-great-grandfather,
Right.
he didn't have seasonal allergies, or the mathematical chances that he has food allergies are essentially zero.
Right.
And so you'd say, well, that was always my problem in med school, right? When we got taught this, it was just everything was so focused on genes and like, this was some innate property. And you're like, what happened? If these genes are so terrible, why didn't our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, why don't they have any problems? Like, I'm not understanding.
Right.
And then they would say, oh, well, maybe the environment brought the gene out, which is like, okay, fine. But you're like, but how, right? Like, I would love to know what specifically brought this gene out,
Right.
because I would love to not be exposed to that. And this
Yeah.
would be true for any schizophrenia, psoriasis, Crohn's, like all of these things where it's just this obsession with trying to find a innate property of the disease.
Right. Right. And you in your lab study an environmental toxin that you found. And I have some inside baseball here because you gave an amazing lecture at Georgetown that I was witnessed. And you talked about the fact that you were looking at this data and this one compound kept coming up and you thought it was like almost like impossible.
Right.
Like you're like, well, surely we can just control this factor or that factor and this link to this one specific environmental toxin will go away. And yet no matter how you framed it or controlled it, this one environmental toxin kept coming up. And because of that toxin, there are then geographic associations because that compound, I hate to use the word toxin, it's like not very scientific, but that compound, that chemical was showing up in certain areas where more cars were present, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this something, can we talk about this a
Yeah,
little bit?
sure.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so what is this compound that you discovered that has this really intense association with eczema incidents, and how does it end up in the environment?
Yeah, so we actually have, I guess I would say, two now. So the first one that we talked about at the lecture was what they just for inside baseball as well, just a non-spatial model. But so it's just we take the EPA databases and say what zip codes have which chemical releases. So the EPA maintains databases, typically about 500 toxic chemical compounds, however you want to phrase it. And you as a company, you tell the EPA how much did you release in the past year. That's all the data we got, right? We don't know, did you release it all in one day or a little bit every single day, but how much did you release in a year? And then we can take clinic databases like you would think of with Aaron Brockovich and cancer clusters. So I want to know which parts of the country have way more atopic derm than you would expect by average or who has less. And then I want to know what are the chemicals found in those areas. And so the first one that came up is called diisocyanates. I had no idea what it was. So we're like, all right, let's try every Jordan Zeldin in the lab. We're like, we're just going to try multiple different mathematical models because if this is real, it should not be dependent on our math, right? So change the math over and over and over again, and this thing just keeps coming up. And so you're like, I don't know what that is. Let me go Google this, figure out what it is. And leading up to that, we had a general sense of what environmental exposures would put a kid at risk. So living in an industrialized country, living in an urban part of an industrialized country were enormous risk factors. Living near highways, wildfires were a big risk for both flares and inducing the disease. And then a lot of weird like in-home behaviors like smoking, which makes everything worse. And then new furniture, wallpaper, renovation behaviors. And so you're like, well, it's hard to link, how am I going to link a new couch with a wildfire, right? And so we say, all right, well, what is diisocyanates in? Well, it turns out diisocyanates are required for memory foam construction. So like what you would find in new furniture. Diisocyanates are made into spandex, which is also associated with it. We did an additional one, which we just published, which was a spatial model, which also implicates xylene, which is another related compound. Both of those were xylene and isocyanates that in earnest were manufactured in 1970, which is right when you see this uptick in atopic derm rates. They became part of automobile exhaust in 1970 with the conversion away from lead, which was another terrible environmental toxin in gasoline. We switched to isocyanate and what they call BTX compounds, so benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. So those became part of automobile exhaust in 1970. And then with the catalytic converter, they became a mandatory part of automobile exhaust. Now, in exchange for less sulfur dioxide and nitric dioxide, which were terrible. So the catalytic converter has its benefits, but an unfortunate side effect, it starts putting these things out. They're made into polyester and nylon and wallpaper glue. They're the only natural source of these two compounds is wildfires. And so like the whole thing just felt very uneasy when you kind of sit back and you're like, this is in every single one of these seemingly disparate exposures. And they all line up right with 1970 in terms of their uptick. And I think the most uncomfortable part was to find that you can purposely give a mouse topical diisocyanate to give it eczema.
Wow.
And then you would treat it with your whatever drug of choice, make the eczema go away. And you can use that data to go to the FDA and say, see, I want to try this in people. And the FDA will say, okay, right? There have been plenty of drugs on the market today that gave mice eczema using this chemical, took it away, and then went to human trials. So the fact that you're like, I have no idea what I'm looking for. And the one thing that just will not go away when we do our math is what I would intentionally use to give mice atopic derm in the lab. And it just happens to be in all of these different factors that are exposed. Like that's really what I felt like rounded it out for us to make us think like, okay, now we need to have a conversation about these fabrics and air purification. And maybe now we really could do something. And it also, I think, speaks to that frustration of the parents when they're like, I'm doing everything right. Why is my kid flaring? Like I'm using the same drugs. I didn't change my soaps. I didn't whatever. It could very easily be that a factory 20 miles away from you put out a chemical that the EPA does not normally track day-to-day releases of, and it just wafted your direction and hit your child, and now they're reacting to it. There's nothing you could have done. So like those kinds of realizations, I think, got us at least excited that maybe we could start doing something more than telling people to try biologics.
Right. Or
basically.
like bathing in bleach baths or
Right,
something.
right.
Another thing that you mentioned in your book, the control for a bleach
Yeah,
bath is
yeah.
just water, so
Water
it's
and
too
bleach,
obvious,
yeah.
terrible placebo. Something that your work that you were just sort of explaining broadly brings up for me is the kind of there's no such thing as a free lunch conversation, where it's like in our modern society we think, oh, we figured out lead in gasoline bad, but we still want to burn tons of gasoline.
Sure.
Like
Right.
not burning tons of gasoline, not an option.
Right.
So no problem. We will just put this thing on the car, and now there are new toxic compounds. We don't yet know how toxic they are.
Correct.
So we'll put that down to our kids and our grandkids to figure out. Similarly, like there's this really cool movement of people who are buying, I've done it myself multiple times, like sweatshirts and blankets that say right on them, like made from recycled plastic water bottles. And you think like, look at me, I'm a goddess. I'm turning trash into a baby blanket. And then you learn that in order to turn trash into a baby blanket, you have to make a baby blanket that's full of a compound that'll just wreck your kid's immune system. Well, that's very horrifying to learn. Like people are thinking I'm doing a really good thing, and these really big companies are getting this great greenwashing opportunity to say, look at us, we made a sweatshirt from old Coke bottles. Like how great are we cleaning up the environment? In fact, polluting the environment very heavily with a compound that is an immune disruptor that is sensitizing everyone's skin and possibly guts and lungs. Because I want to ask, eczema, it exists in this inflammatory triad, right? Allergy, eczema, asthma, which my eldest has experienced the whole triad. And also, as a side note off of that, like there are so many things internally and personally that I controlled with my next two children that I believe prevented them from having those things. But also, as she was my first baby, there were all the brand new products and the plastics and the polyesters. And, this house had just been built and she was raised in a brand new home, new couches, new paint, new everything, new PVC piping for all of our water, etc. So a lot of factors that I was not thinking about at all and wouldn't have had a reason to think about. But like eczema, at least we can see, right? So when you realize these compounds are actually sort of breaking down this skin barrier, we can see that. But are these compounds playing a role in asthma? I mean, we're breathing them in. Is it possible that they're not playing a role in asthma?
They were associated with asthma too. They were number 2 on the list for asthma. They were number 1 on the list for food allergies. So now some of it, the phenotypes that are that linked, it's tough, right? Because anything associated with one should be associated with the others.
Right.
We did have multiple controls in there. So when we ran environmental analyses for something like psoriasis, so another inflammatory skin disease, isocyanates and xylene do not show up on that list at all. Other things do, and that would speak to a different chemical inducing a different response. We looked at autism, and the number isocyanates not on that list, right? Another pediatric disease on the rise in industrialized countries. Instead, what you see is cadmium. The mouse model for autism is to give it a bunch of cadmium, and so this just kept coming up every time we did this, where you would get a different chemical at the top of the list for whatever disease. Now, asthma, the triad would be shared, right?
Right.
And then it would only take you like the third PubMed link, and you'd already have an overwhelming amount of evidence that that chemical made sense to be linked with that disease, sometimes purposefully, right, with the mice. So, yeah, I really think, and we're trying to build out like a searchable model so that like patients could just access this and say like, well, what chemicals are what are the chemicals associated with eczema in my area? And then where would I find these? How could I avoid these? Those kinds of things. Because I think there are a lot of diseases for which when you're like, oh, I don't really know what's going on, and the search for the gene has been a total failure. I think there's a lot of these diseases that we don't appreciate are driven by different chemicals that have, like you said, it's no free lunch, right? They have a benefit. I like having wood that's sealed too, right? I don't want my wood deck to just rot underneath me, but now I better appreciate that like painting that stuff on to keep water from getting anywhere near this otherwise natural product, it comes with a cost, right? And that's the trade-off that we're going to make. And I think if parents were more informed, maybe you'd make different decisions, right? And so that kind of thing.
Right. And part of it, I think, is, as you just said, if you have the information, you at least get to make a choice.
Mm-hmm.
You can at least go, okay, well, it is important to me that my baby's car seat is flame retardant
Right.
because in an accident, I don't want her engulfed in flames, but maybe her pajamas don't have to be.
Right.
Maybe we're going to buy the organic cotton pajama and we're going to just wear them tight fitting, right? Like you can make those conscious decisions if you have the financial purchasing power to do so. And that's a whole other policy conversation, which of course we should get into. But I think like to not even know about it, like how many people are even comfortable knowing that the EPA just keeps a database of all the toxic compounds that are being strewn into the environment. Like, I'm glad that they're tracking it, but does the average person even know how many compounds are being tracked because they're known to be poisonous and yet they continue to be put into the environment? I think that we think about water quality and we hopefully think about food quality. And cadmium, of course, can come up in the food supply, and that's very dangerous and one of the reasons that I fear home gardening. But do we think about air quality? Like, I remember last summer with the wildfires, I really, truly had never thought about air like that. And I felt so vulnerable because here I was like outdoors trying to go for a hike and I really felt terrible. And it was just as simple as hundreds, thousands of miles away, something was burning.
Right.
And it was impacting my life. That's crazy.
Yeah. The sky shouldn't have to turn orange for you to appreciate the possibility that pollution is a problem. Or in Flint. Right?
Exactly.
Or McDowell County, West Virginia, where they had the chemical explosion and coal tar roll in, or New Palestine, Ohio now, right? With that explosion of the train, right? Like the second that happens, everybody appreciates the infrastructure that America has, that you can go take a shower, you can turn on the tap, and you don't have to fear what's going to happen to you from that. And the second that's taken away, like now all of a sudden you get it, but it's like it shouldn't have to be the most stark, catastrophic events to say, like, all right, well, what is happening on the low level? What happens if like tiny doses of this are getting on my child every day, for their entire development? Now I should be like, shouldn't I be worried about that? Like, what could we do about that? And I think the tide is turning. I hope in the society, at least in research, because people like you can't get through college now without a microbiome lecture.
Yeah,
like that word never came up for me through med school. That never was mentioned. And like, it's impossible, you probably can't even get out of middle school now without some mention of their good bacteria and bad bacteria, right? Like even just the basics you can't have. So
especially if you're my kid, then you can't get out of the house in the morning.
All the time. It's like, oh my gosh, are you talking about the microbiome again? So
yes, and I will never stop.
Exactly.
Get used to it.
Right. So that's why he gets to drink kombucha. So I guess he's okay with it, right?
Oh,
because he doesn't get soda. So
yeah.
But like that's. Yeah, I think the tide is turning, and I hope people appreciate it more.
Okay, well, I could really talk with you forever about eczema and allergies and environmental toxic chemicals because this is a topic that I think does not get enough attention and which, frankly, I think like parents really just need to know more about. And so hopefully your work kind of hits the mainstream a bit more. But speaking of your work being available to the mainstream,
there you go.
You have a book and I've read it and I'm just going to at the jump say that everyone should read it. It's also available in an audiobook format for those busy moms who prefer to consume their books in the car or while doing laundry, which I do recommend audiobooks and laundry. Great combination. But this book is not about your research per se. You do touch on it, but it's about a much bigger and broader topic, which is the topic of population genetics research and all of the flaws in that field. So I'm very curious because obviously, you're an immunologist by training, you're a medical doctor with an MPH, you're doing this research, immunology focused, maybe chemical focused, and then you get the urge to write a book about population genetics. So explain to the listener the bridge between what you're doing and what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, so I think, like I said at the beginning, like during the allergy training, there was all this like so much focus on like a specific gene. We just could not get past talking about genetic predispositions. And I got a chance to talk to some of the biggest names that had built their name on this gene to say, like, what we discussed. Why wasn't this a problem generations ago? Or why would a Black American have a 20% chance of getting eczema, but a Black African, particularly West Africa, where most of the descendants would have been and the slave trade would have initiated, have a 4% chance at best, or a 1% chance? Like, how do you explain this? And it was just always like, well, we don't know, the world is unknowable, it's complex, and there's just no satisfactory answer. And part of me thought, all right, look, if they want to go spin their wheels and dedicate their career to finding a gene that's going to explain eczema, good for them, right? Like, it doesn't genuinely affect me. There were times where I had to kind of like insist that those kinds of people not be in charge of reviewing my work so that I could get, I thought, a more fair shake. But like, all right, you want to do that, go for it. And then, Buffalo, the shooting in Buffalo. And it makes it so much more obvious that the genetic determinism and this idea that everything is, meaningfully encoded into the genes, even if you give some caveat that like, well, environment's important too, that is not a benevolent behavior. And like, I always knew that, of course, that you could see scientific racism or whatever, but it was always like, that's what the racist people do. And, they're always going to say something. And to watch the field of population genetics defend itself during Buffalo and see that the same talking points from white supremacists, when they would explain away the flaws in their genetic data, you could hear it identically, almost verbatim, from the allergy researchers who will explain, well, this or that. And obviously the allergy research did not have a bigoted intent. They don't mean to be disrespectful or rude, but when they start making these implications that like all of these different traits are so substantively encoded into the genome, we should focus our energy there. That's what really, I think, made me start to look into it more and wanted to be more critical of that behavior. And really, I thought, connect it back to say what we were discussing in the beginning about that disconnect between patients and their providers and the patient groups. Every one of them now think doctors are nothing more than prescription pads. We don't care. We're all in pharmaceuticals pocket. And some of them are. But you don't have to be and still live your life in service of pharmaceuticals. Because if you believe your daughter was broken, she has an allergy because something's wrong with her, then I'm the hero for finding the chemical that will right her biology. And even if you genuinely believe that, I still think that it's harmful. And I didn't feel like the people who are advancing the idea that asthma and allergies are genetic got the criticism they deserved after Buffalo.
Yeah, and I don't want listeners to miss this point, so I'm going to lean in a little bit.
Sure.
So there was a horrific mass shooting in Buffalo that was just racist in nature. And his justification, his sort of rant-filled letter, I believe, that he left behind, explained that he had been reading genetics research and that he believed that there was an inferiority that he was wiping away or something horrible and disgusting along those lines. And in response to that, you heard the genetics community kind of spinning their wheels trying to explain why this wasn't a problem and didn't involve them, as opposed to hearing how maybe the work they were doing was actually justifying, validating, and contributing to this sort of eugenicist, racist narrative that is rooted in a essential flaw or genetic inferiority. I want to ask a really difficult question, and I'm going to just put the room in there that we could clip it out if it doesn't if it doesn't work.
Okay.
But something that I struggle with as a mom to a child with eczema, allergies, anaphylaxis, asthma, who very much sees all of the environmental things that brought that about in her and then prevented it in my two other children. I see this conflation of dysfunction and diversity, which I feel like is walking us in this weird, incorrect direction, even though it's well-intentioned. So I'll phrase it differently. There is true diversity in this world, and diversity is very healthy, and diversity is very beautiful, and diversity is just nature. Nature is highly diverse. That just is how it is, and natural environments are healthier and stronger, generally speaking. The microbiome, the forest, a coral reef, healthier when it's more diverse. And then there's dysfunction, right? There's a child like my daughter who's born, a series of things kick in, some microbes are missing from her gut, and then she has eczema, anaphylaxis, and asthma. That's not diversity. That's dysfunction. But right now, it's almost like if you say to certain populations, certain patient groups, that what they're experiencing is dysfunction, that is called bigotry. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think
like
so.
if I say that I want to heal my daughter's allergies, and I do, I fully believe that in her lifetime, I'm going to give it 10 more years.
Okay.
We're going to cure anaphylaxis. We're going to fully understand the root cause. We're going to inoculate. We're going to get her a fecal microbiota transplant. We're going to upregulate Treg cells. We're going to downregulate all the super inflammatory compounds. And we are going to calm and train her nervous system and immune system towards balanced, healthy immune response to food antigens, right? I'm a believer. But there are people for whom that kind of statement might be heard as, maybe bigoted is too strong of a word, but like closed-minded. Like, I shouldn't want to fix her. She's beautiful and
Sure.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see it.
So in this space where actual diversity is the law of nature and is good and is beautiful and is normal, how can we be careful? Where do we find the line? How can we be careful to separate dysfunction? You know, a child born with eczema is experiencing a painful dysfunction. It's not a beautiful variation of nature. It is some chemical in their environment is sensitizing their immune system. How can we make it okay to have that conversation about healing and not have it trickle into a more bigoted conversation?
Right. I think what I would say is, particularly from the immune system standpoint, that's easier. I don't know that dysfunction necessarily is the right term in the sense of the following. Like, is it possible that her immune system is doing every single thing correct? Every single challenge that she's been given, the immune system responded precisely as it was supposed to do.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that has led her to symptoms and consequences. So, for example, you sprain your ankle. Your body is supposed to swell and hurt. It is supposed to hurt so that you don't blindly go running off and blow your ankle apart. You need to give it time to heal, and the swelling is to keep it immobile. Now, we can get over that by using medications, get the swelling down, use a brace to immobilize it externally. So the swelling is normal. That's supposed to happen, but it's creating a problem that now maybe I have to address. So I think, talking to those communities and saying, there is nothing wrong with her. Her immune system, and there's one caveat, I'll come back to it, but her immune system is doing what it's supposed to do, but it is generating a unintended consequence that is now so severe that it is disrupting her life. That we can get away. Like, she's fine, but if we start doing the right things, her immune system will go back to not generating these harmful consequences for her. The one caveat is some of these things, particularly when the exposure was early on, it might be harder to undo that damage, right? That there might be immunologic scars, so to speak, that we just can't get rid of. I don't know. But I personally think that there is a pathologizing of all of these things to say, well, there must be something wrong with you and the way that you are operating. But if no one is shocked that some of those kids that got the highest doses of lead are going to have neurotoxicity signs. There's no like, well, some kids are just unlucky. You're like, no, the kids that got the highest dose got hurt the worst. The people who had the highest rates of leukemia after a nuclear meltdown are the people who live closest to the plant. This is not rocket science, right? The dose is high enough, the physiology becomes anticipated. There's a intake of alcohol where everybody will get inebriated and start to throw up and your liver will break down. It might be subtly different between us, but it's still there. And I think that you could have a conversation about that her symptoms are creating dysfunction in her life, but her immune system is working correctly.
Yes.
And so if we can reorient it tiny, not fix her or change her, but just say like, let's get the immune system to go back to doing what it was supposed to calm down, like you said, like calm it down and say it doesn't have to fight this battle anymore. Then it's not really a fix, and maybe people will be open to that.
Right. And actually, I completely agree with that framing, because when I began to study food allergy, I realized, oh, well, every invader in the body has an antigen spike that the body responds to. And what's a food protein look like? A really big, really, 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 really big antigen spike. Like whatever a viral antigen size is, and I don't know what the size is, I'm guessing a peanut protein is just magnitudes larger. So it makes sense that the immune system would totally freak out. And of course, for some reason, let's just use peanut. Peanut protein got into her bloodstream at some point, and her body correctly identified that it shouldn't be there and had this anaphylactic immune response to it. So I agree. It is, and same thing with like eczema or any kind of like symptom the body is showing us. I say this a lot to people, is like, the symptom is not the problem. And so many of the things that are treatments are just suppressing the symptom.
Correct.
But your body was trying to say something.
Right.
The symptom was correct. So the treatment is reversing the symptom, but is it reversing the thing your body was trying to tell you about? Probably not, except maybe in the case of like antibiotics or, things that are actually removing the infective compound.
Correct.
So yes, I agree. And I like that framing. Okay, back to the book. Something that you say in the book that I think is really interesting and important, it's sort of around halfway through, you talk about the money that is spent. Because, of course, like we were talking about with celery juice, it's like, what's the big deal? People want to try celery juice. Fine. What's the big deal? People want to hunt for a gene for allergies. Fine. But first of all, as you already mentioned, it sort of ends up tiptoeing towards this racist eugenics mindset. And also, so many millions or billions of dollars are now allocated for this, chasing of a gene that may or may not ever lead to any treatment or even any kind of actionable information. And that's kind of, from a population and financial burden perspective, not really fair. Can you say a bit more about that?
I don't think it's ethical.
Yeah.
Even. So at this point, if you can search for something, it's called NIH Reporter. It's a website where you can type in search terms, and it'll tell you how much money the NIH has given out in grants over the years for whatever matches that search term. So like eczema and genetics is $750 million. Now, to be fair, we put us next to the Department of Defense budget. That's like a rounding error for the Pentagon, but it's still $750 million over the 40, 50 years history of the eczema research has gone to, let's go chase down a gene. And let's go through what we have to show for it. If you had sent off all three of your daughters, or it's 3 daughters, sorry. Yeah, so all 3 of your daughters' genetics, you send all 3 of them off to any company you want and say, tell me which one of them has atopic derm or asthma. They can't do it. Your grandchildren, one day, send off a genetic screen. Which one's at risk for it? They can't tell you. Which treatments would be best? They can't tell you. Which nutritional improvements might improve their eczema the best? Can't tell you. Right? So it has led to nothing. There is no clinical utility for this in any way, shape, or form. There's monogenic disorders, so somebody who has a genuine mutation, but those are almost always syndromes. So they have eczema plus a fungal pneumonia or some, a bacteria growing a hole in their liver. Those are not easily confused with regular eczema or asthma or anything like that. So we spend all this money on this, and it's always somewhere in the future, right? If we just do one more study, we just get more people, more sequencing power, more computational power, man, we'll have this thing figured out. And I hear that from the eczema researchers or the asthma researchers, but I also hear it from the people who are convinced that will unlock the mysteries of intelligence or cognition or criminal behavior or racial disparities. Whether they have bigoted intentions or not, when they say it, it's always like, you just give me a little bit more money and I'll figure it out. And, to the same extent, like, there are people dying now of these disorders. There are people suffering now, and we're not doing anything. Like, can we move on? Right? Is there a point at which we could say, all right, how many people do we need to sequence before you'd say, okay, I guess, you know what? The secret wasn't in the genome, our fault. It was worth a shot, right?
Right.
And I don't see any of that from the community.
Meanwhile, I have run an N of 2 study in my own
There you
family,
go.
and if you have 100 mil, I would happily take it because I produced great outcomes.
Exactly.
No
Yeah.
eczema, asthma, or anaphylaxis in those 2 children. Where is my funding?
Exactly.
I feel very underfunded in this endeavor. The other thing about this is that, throwing it back again to this conversation about, don't take that supplement because there's no RCT for it. In this research, this population genetics research, which we all are familiar with from the news because the news loves these studies.
Yeah, they absolutely
It's like
do. Yeah.
a gene has been found for, whether or not strawberries taste like a summer day.
Right.
And you're like, really? I must have it.
Mhm.
But what you point out in the book is that there is no control group often in these studies. Can you say a bit more about that? Because how is this science if there's no control?
Right. I think most people are probably familiar with the ancestry sites where you pay money and they'll tell you you're 12% Irish or whatever. There's a little pseudoscience to when they come up with like a hard percentage, but fine. Like in general, you can collect somebody's genome and make a guess as to how similar their great-great-great-grandfather was to people who currently live in Ireland's great-great-great-grandfather, right? And so you get that there are ways to genetically distinguish populations, Irish and British, and certainly Irish and Liberian or whatever. But so what, right? It doesn't make you Irish. There's no gene that says that you are Irish. So there are differences. So what you want as a negative control is some situation where you expect there to be some background noise. You expect there to be signal, but you can dismiss that signal. That's like, okay, this is the bottom line. The analogy I use in the book is listening to a car driving, right? Now electric cars are changing it. They'll have that weird hum.
Yeah.
But like the really cool sports cars, in your head, you can guess at how fast a car is going by the sound that it is making. But if you're standing next to a car that's idling, you can also know that's zero. It's making noise, making a significant amount of noise. But you say, that's zero, because you know that's background sound. And population genetics, I joke that like I want to see somebody calculate the polygenic score for being French Canadian, because you can do that. You can run of like how different are two populations. Then we can start to ask, well, how different is somebody with eczema for somebody with not? Because if they're just running different social circles or exposed to different things, well, then that too will also give you a signal. So I want to know what's my background noise, and they've never done that. We've brought it up to some population geneticists, and they're like, oh no, the control group is the people who don't have eczema. It's like, no, it's not true,
Right.
because that would assume that there is a situation in which the genes are just completely randomized between the two populations, and you're testing to see whether it's truly, how different from pure randomization is it. But we know that's not true. Like genes come in chromosomes, and they come in packets, and they come in family trees at this point. So it's like they're not genuinely randomized. So I want to see a negative control, and they've never done it.
One of the things that I want to point out to any listener who thinks like, oh, I'm not a scientist, so maybe this book isn't for me, is that this book's actually very funny. You have a great sense of humor throughout the whole thing. And one of the things that you do is you use humor to drive home some really important points. So for example, there's a part here where you talk about how you could run one of these GWAS studies and find a gene for whether or not you like chicken wings or whether or not you enjoy watching football. And that gene might actually be similar. But one of the more horrifying things that you mention is an actual study that claimed to find a gene for being abused as a child.
Yep.
Not being abusive,
right?
Not even something within a family. They did not qualify who the abuser was.
Correct.
It was just people who had reported suffering any kind of adverse childhood trauma. And then they ran a quote unquote study, and they found a gene that made you more likely to be abused. And then this got published and shopped around like it was a totally okay thing to say. And when you take a step back, something you said in the book is suggesting that there's a gene for likelihood to be abused, suggests that there's a behavior that a child could do that would justify abusing them. And you said something like, just how annoying would your kid have to be for you to do something to them where you would officially decide that it was their fault, that they had genetically caused you to do this. So can you talk a bit about that? Like, How often is this kind of research happening? And I use the research term with
Right.
big, heavy air quotes. This kind of research where you're searching for a gene for something that, I mean, if it's not obvious that eczema has an environmental factor, it should at least be obvious that
Right.
childhood abuse has so many environmental things going on, and that certainly the child themselves would not be to blame, and certainly the genetics of the child themselves wouldn't be to blame. How often is this kind of trash, horrifying research making its way to the public and to the publications?
Constantly. I mean, the important part of the abuse one is that it was serious stuff. This was not my kid mouthed off and I spanked them, right? Which I know would meet the definition for abuse. This was like the police are going to get called on you and the kid might be removed from the home, that level of abuse. And the authors said, well, maybe it makes them behave in such a way with no explanation of like, what exactly would that look like? What behavior do you think you'd be like, oh yeah, that kid's definitely going to get abused if he behaves like that? The other one they said was like, well, maybe they're going to be more likely to report the abuse. You're like, well, that's a huge difference, and you should probably look into that. The other thing that the population geneticists will do is then try to justify it by saying, well, this trait is associated with some other trait. So in that one, they say like, oh, being abused, the genes for being abused are associated with the genes for depression, but not the genes for heart disease. So there you go. See, they're the same. They're under the same genetic control. And you're like, I can think of lots of reasons depression would befall somebody who had suffered that versus coronary artery disease. And you'll see the same stuff. I just saw one, Nature Communications, where it was the genes for being a self-described morning person. And they said that it was associated with whether you were a heavy sleeper or an inversely associated with a night owl, being a night owl. So there you go. These are the genes that govern whether or not you are a self-described person. At no point do they ask, do you have small children in your house? Because in my life, that has been the biggest dictator of what time of day I'm waking up.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to ask them how daylight saving time folded in, but that then becomes, as silly as that is to laugh at, that's a Nature Communications paper. That's not some journal, for those who don't know, that's not some like predatory journal or like some trash site. And the abuse one was in Lancet Psychiatry. So not some slow tier, whatever joke journal that we can make fun of. That then translates into some of these ancestry sites where you can go online and it'll tell you based on your genome and your age, we think you wake up at 8:48 a.m. And like, if the public believes that this is real, right? That they think like, wow, my genome can tell me I get up at 8:48 a.m., then they're going to believe a lot of other, like they're more open to the
Right.
more silly ones. And I think
Right.
people kind of recoil against the abuse one. That's why I kind of bring it up. But the logic, the math, the statistical approach is indistinguishable from all of the other genetic association studies that they'll run. And that's what makes, I think, it so much more dangerous, because then people like that, if I don't know the researchers for that one, but if you really push them, I guarantee you they'll say, oh, well, we did exactly what so-and-so did for asthma or autism or schizophrenia or whatever other disorder. We're not doing any other different methods. Do you think theirs is illegitimate? And of course, my answer is yes.
Indeed, I do.
Right. But then that's the thing. The entire infrastructure of that kind of research is all in the same boat together, which is why I think they haven't been able to divorce themselves from the bigoted connotations, because if they're all built on the same foundation and it'll all collapse. And that's why I think they hold on and we'll get into denial mode.
Right. And something else that I think maybe like people that haven't spent a lot of time getting a science education won't be as familiar with the null hypothesis concept, but in any scientific conversation, you're always trying to outthink yourself, right? If you have a hypothesis or you're trying to understand something, you want to go through all the different ways that you might be wrong or not quite looking at it correctly, and then establish a null hypothesis, trying to disprove almost the opposite of what you're trying to uncover. But you mentioned that there really aren't null hypotheses in this field. And like throwing it back again to this child abuse research, again, heavily air quoted, I'm just thinking like, if you're open to talking about maybe the gene is actually for willingness to report or likelihood to report, then what about Did they live in a community with a police force that they trusted?
Mm-hmm.
Did they live in a neighborhood where there was education in the schools about who to call if a parent is abusing you? I mean, there are so many environmental conditions. Do they have a grandparent that they trust so that is it a gene for having a living grandparent who might care for you if your mom goes to jail for beating you?
Mm-hmm.
There are so many things that I just right now in this moment could think of to go, well, maybe it's a gene that explains these 100 environmental things, that it's almost impossible for me to picture a scientist who's doing science and thinking scientifically could possibly move forward with this. Like, why are they not turning the cube around and looking at it from all these different angles and going, well, maybe this is just silly, maybe I'm just not even asking the right question.
Yeah, there was a conference, it was last time, the big allergy association conference, and they had somebody go up there talk about the genes for racial disparities in asthma or whatever. And as she was going on, she talked about, she made a joke. She said, well, everything that's not genetic is the environment, to a geneticist. And she kind of chuckled and moved on. And like, part of me is like, is that a self-defense chuckle that how ridiculous that sounded? Or, why is that funny?
Right.
Because the idea that to just say like, oh, well, the environment is just some monolith, right? Like, we're over here doing the real science where we're, parsing out individual base pairs, and the environment is just some nebulous thing that causes it. And the part I think, I don't talk about it in there, but it has come to my attention that is the most annoying is that all of these people, if you were to say, if their city where they lived were to announce, we are going to install a oil refinery next to your kid's kindergarten, they would be the greatest environmentalist on the planet. They would be able to articulate to you all the reasons why that particular exposure is dangerous and why they do not want it in their community, but they will spend every day at work implying that like all of this disease burden out there is some, genetic predisposition, and they not even bother to look at the environment, just treat it as a monolith, even if they believe it needs an environmental context, spend no effort or energy to look into it.
So I'm feeling this like call to action right now. I'm getting a little riled up because as I'm hearing you talk and I'm reflecting on the book, I'm really thinking like every dollar that we allocate to this type of research, we are not allocating to social systems, to putting infrastructure in place to prevent environmental contamination, to improving the food system, to improving social services, to having affordable childcare. Like, let's use another thing like maternal depression and then like the maternal mortality that's associated with severe maternal depression. My guess is that if you were to look at the literature, there's a higher incidence of this kind of morbid maternal depression in lower income women. Is there a gene for maternal depression that also is a gene that predicts your earning? Or is it possible that in a country with a very weak social support system, that being a mother with no support, struggling to pay your bills, can't afford childcare, can't afford whatever, organic cotton pajamas to prevent the eczema in your kid, can't afford to move away from the roadway, etc., that would cause depression, that all of these environmental things that are tied to your economic status would add up, and leaving your genes aside, even if genes played a 10% role, which seems generous, it still wouldn't touch the environmental concerns. You could clean up all of that maternal depression, taking all the money that we're funding GWAS studies, and instead build daycare centers and do more research on how we can still have cars, but maybe have cars be a little bit less poisonous and improve our water supply. I mean, I'm really feeling like, again, there's no free lunch and we don't have endless money to print. So if we're allocating resources, how can we say, sorry, we can't afford more funding for WIC, but we are going to chase the gene for whatever it is for as long as we can go? That feels, like you said, it's not ethical.
Right. And it's worse than maternal depression. It's maternal mortality.
Right.
There's all kinds of GWAS studies claiming that they found a gene for women dying in pregnancy. And you really just want to sit them down and say, diagram how that survives evolution, right? How could you possibly, like, you'd have to have a countervailing benefit, right? You would have to say, oh, okay, well, so-and-so has a gene for dying in pregnancy, but she's impervious to bullets or something, right? You'd have to have something to counterbalance
Yeah.
this obvious deleterious loss if it were to survive on a population scale. No answer. And, in the book, I talk about that there's one healthcare system for which there is no racial disparity in maternal mortality. There's no racial disparity in pancreatic cancer mortality, and that's the military. And there was a report that came out that was basically like the doctors and nurses kind of ignore Black women, when they're like, I'm having pain or something feels wrong, they're more likely to be ignored. And when that came out, the military was like, well, this is terrible. We can't do this. And they implemented all of these policies and put them in place so that this wouldn't happen. And so even though sometimes there's still more bleeding risk or more infection risk in certain populations, they don't go unnoticed. They don't go ignored. And so they've basically erased the racial disparities and, by the way, lowered the mortality risk for everyone, no matter what their background was. And so you'd say, that didn't cost them that. That was education. That was, policies and procedures that got implemented. That wasn't a $750 million endeavor from the military to do that. And you're talking about life-altering, life-saving interventions. And yet, you're still going to find money going out the door to go say, well, you know what? If we just find the right gene or the right set of genes, we're going to figure this all out and we're going to prevent maternal mortality. And that's what's so frustrating is like the best case scenario is that you will discover some miracle drug that will do what?
Right.
Prevent maternal mortality.
Right.
Well, like if you found a drug that was half as good as sanitation, you'd win the Nobel Prize for pharmacology, you'd be the richest person on the planet because you just see how powerful these things are and they go underappreciated, but we're just not spending our resources on that. And it is aggravating.
Yeah. It's like we're addicted to searching for a magic bullet because we believe that some person will find this one thing that will sort of turn off the problem. But as you mentioned in the book, genes don't just do one thing.
Right.
So I think you mentioned it in reference to the child abuse study where it's like, okay, if you found there was a gene that made someone likelier to report child abuse, would you turn it off and just have them suffer in silence or what, right? Similarly,
what do I do with this? Yeah.
Right. And then what else does that gene do? It could do 10 other things in the body. Maybe it also prevents the common cold or, right, like makes those viral receptors less sensitive, whatever it is. That's a random example, but I'm just saying like a gene can do so many things and we may not always know. So if we target that gene thinking we're going to stop this one thing, let's use maternal mortality. You find the gene that predicts maternal mortality and you turn it off. And then women don't want to get pregnant. It removes their desire to have babies because it just transforms something in their immune system and nervous system and they go, no, thank you. And then the population collapses, right? Like, whoops, a weird negative downside to this genetic potential.
Or I think more likely it'll do nothing.
Or it just does nothing.
Because it's a spurious association
that
is below your background noise, but you didn't bother to calculate the background noise.
Right.
And so therefore you're like, oh, this gene's associated with whatever. And you're like, it's not. It's just a mathematical quirk that you set your threshold so low that you can pick up anything, right? The GWAS was built for chickens in a farm, right? In a lab. Right? They were trying to find, how do I get the fattest possible chicken?
Is that really where all this comes from, is chickens?
And as an agriculture, that makes sense, right? You want big, muscular birds. And so like you have these inbred birds.
Right.
And you're trying to see what seems to predict who's the biggest, plumpest that I can sell for the most. And it's in a lab. It's not even on a farm, right? Like you would never run that experiment where you gave one chicken's access to healthcare and ample food and water and a nice, comfortable living. And then the other one was like near a highway where it's noisy and they are food deprived and are constantly drinking lead. Like you would never run that experiment and then claim that those two populations of chickens are the same. If you attempted to publish that in a veterinary journal, they would laugh at you because they'd be like, what are you doing? Of course, those aren't comparable situations, but you can run a GWAS where you collect data from people who live in the heart of London, breathing, the London pollution, and then out in the sticks and say, well, they're all Europeans, they're all British, so we can lump them all together and just be fine with it. And that's, it is an amazing practice to see it. And that's why I think I wanted to write it because I feel like the people who are doing this because they want to cure asthma, and their heart is in the right place compared to the people who just want to foment anti-Semitism or racism or whatever. But it's like your arguments are not different.
Right.
And I just hope that you would understand that so we can move on.
Right. Something that does come up in both your research and the book is the microbiome, which is a favorite topic of mine.
Yep.
So just very quickly, I want to ask you about the future of microbiome research because I love the microbiome. And as someone who was stumbling around in the dark trying to figure it out 18 years ago when I had this allergy baby and a lot of dysbiosis, I'm very excited and hopeful about how much attention it's getting now. However, some of the flaws that you mention of population genetics research remind me a lot of things that I see in the microbiome research today. For example, you talk about sometimes a gene will be found and you'll see a publication that it's associated with, yes, having X condition. And then you'll see it published that it's associated with no, not having X condition. Well, how can that be? Like, let's ask a better question. I see this happening in microbiome research where you'll get a bacterial species, and there are these charts online now, and there are some like databases where you can go and type in a species and see what it comes up to be associated with. And there are some species that are both positively and negatively associated with, for example, food allergies, or positively and negatively associated with multiple sclerosis, and many other things. So knowing that this field is so messy, and of course, genetics is incredibly messy, right? Like even if there are genetic associations, it's probably not one gene, it's probably 100 working together or whatever, right? So knowing how messy this field of microbiome research is and looking ahead, staring off into the distance, using your magic 8-ball. What do you think microbiome researchers should be aware of, should go into their research with, learning from the failures of other fields in order to not waste money, time, and replicate these failures? What can they be thinking about in terms of, is it a clarifying the question? Is it a controlling for more things? Is it a looking at function versus species? What do you think microbiome researchers should do to avoid some of these pitfalls?
Yeah, number one is function over species. So I think part of the reason why you could see this complete dichotomy of like, yes, it's associated or no, it's not, is that the same organism can behave differently in different environments. And, we've known this, that you can take, somebody with a normal, quote unquote, however you want to define that, normal microbiome, feed them, high fat diet or high ultra processed diet. And the species don't immediately die off. They don't have a completely different species, but those species start behaving inappropriately and they'll produce things that are net harmful for their survival. They're trying to do what they can. These bacteria have not evolved the way to dissolve preservatives that were invented in 2005. So they have no way to do anything else. They're going to chew it up, and whatever metabolite they spit out may or may not be good for you. And so having an understanding of function would, I think, be very important. Understanding that the microbiome is also not randomly generated between populations. As we discussed, like you get the overwhelming majority on the way out of the vaginal canal from your mother, or now with C-sections that could jeopardize that. It's more malleable, obviously, because what your diets are and antibiotics are going to throw that off. But you could be picking up a microbiome that just reflects being from a family with a shared social structure or social exposures, and kind of be more mindful of that and make sure that we have a understanding of like negative controls and articulating like, all right, what is our, like, what how big of a difference in microbiomes could we get, for example, between Inuits and people in New York? And then that's now our background, right? So now we can say, all right, this is the background noise. How can we go from that? And something else that you mentioned earlier was an understanding of systems that, it's great. There's I think microbiome research is going to have a lot of low-hanging fruit where one organism is going to have one function and it's going to be useful. We'll use it as a probiotic. It's wonderful. That's great. That will probably, there are only so many of those out there, because if it was really that awesome, every human would have that one organism and we wouldn't have any variation. So it's going to be, I need this organism in conjunction with these 5 others. And so obsessing over finding a singular answer when sometimes it could just be a global understanding, I hope we start moving in that direction. And I think function helps with some of that. And microbiome research can help because I do think there's an expectation that if you're going to blame a single organism, you need to have some kind of mouse model, you need to have grown it, you need something to back that up. Not always. I do worry that as it becomes harder and harder to prove your one organism is meaningful, that people will just say, oh, well, association is all we need. That
Right.
was our candidate bacteria thing, like they had the candidate gene era. But we'll see.
Yeah, and of course, there's already conversations happening about postbiotics and, prescription postbiotics. And can we just
Right.
capture the metabolites that are produced by the beneficial microbes under the right conditions and use those as drugs?
I heard that all the time leading up to our research because
Yeah.
we use a probiotic topically for therapy for atopic derm, and it's still in research, but actually be over the counter pretty soon, where people will be able to just get it. And during the run up, everyone said, "Well, why don't you just extract whatever magic is in there and then put it in a lotion?" And my concerns were, number one, I have no idea about the pharmacokinetics. So even let's pretend it's one magic metabolite that this thing is making. Is slathering yourself in it 2 to 3 times a day equivalent to the tiny amount that this bacteria is making 24/7? Probably not.
Right.
Do I need to add so many preservatives if I extract it from its natural habitat to keep it from breaking down that now the preservatives become a problem? Don't know. And at best, if none of that's true and you just, hey, once a day and everything's wonderful, I'm still committing this person to needing a topical therapy for the rest of their life or for the rest of their disease duration. Or if we could give them back a better microbiome, recolonize their skin, the microbe will do it for us. And then as long as they don't, get some other horrible insult to kill it all off, well, now they can maintain that benefit for long periods of time. And that's why I was like, I just don't care to go chasing after the extract approach because it's just another drug. Like the patients don't want another drug.
Right.
They want some kind of right my ship, get me back in the right direction, and then I don't want to have to be committed to medicine for the rest of my life. And I don't feel like that was a normal mindset, And I was lucky that we had mentors that were open to that idea because, you tell them, I would like to spray a gram-negative rod on a child, to an infectious disease specialist. They're like, what are you doing? So we did a lot of safety work ahead of time to make sure that wasn't, people weren't going to get infected with the organism that we were using. But the whole idea was like the living organism is the only way that you'll right the ship. If they're hurt because they have the wrong bacteria, we can correct that and then they won't need us anymore. They don't need the drug for the rest of their life.
Right.
And I think that's been our focus.
Well, that doesn't sound very profitable.
It
is
not.
How are you going to build your $10 million mansion with all of your findings?
It's not. We gave away the patent, so now I'm not even going to make any money off of the over-the-counter. But
this is not the American science I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time where it was in pharmaceutical pipeline, and they were floating ideas of like, it should be about as expensive as Eucrisa, which is a prescription drug, which is not. It's most people, if you don't have insurance, you're not even going to having the conversation of it, right? So you're not paying that out of pocket, but it's an expensive drug. And I was like, you can grow this in an easy bake oven, right? Like there's some part of you that's kind of like, I don't know that we should be selling this for thousands of dollars, when you could just get one dose and have as many doses as you've ever dreamed of in a week, And
Right.
so the whole regulatory infrastructure has got to change. It was not built for probiotics, right? It was built for pharmaceuticals and single molecules and whatever. And the patent office had never issued a patent like this before. We had to talk to them about it. The FDA is getting there. And so the whole infrastructure is going to have to change to start allowing this, because otherwise, if you say you have to go through the normal route, then it will cost $50,000 a year for this thing that you could just grow in yogurt, which is just insane. So hopefully that'll shift.
Well, one of the reasons that I love your work, and there are so many reasons, is that it just puts the magnifying glass on the sort of social equity conversation around things like the microbiome and the immune system because of how many environmental factors exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also puts the magnifying glass on like whether or not we can really give industry a free pass to just create things that we are coming to know are harming the microbiome. So off the top of my head, polyester pajamas for babies, nylon underwear for women, to what extent are these cheap, fast fashion products exacerbating chronic health conditions and raising healthcare costs and then the cost burden associated for the entire nation? Like, I think that your work helps to connect those dots and show that we can't ignore the environmental issues that are causing or supporting and leading towards these conditions, that we really have to focus on them. And then also, like you say, that the solution can be very simple if we pay attention to functionality, if we just allow for function to take over and don't obsess over a magic bullet compound that we can sell for $1 million. So,
Right.
Let's leave that to the monogenic conditions that maybe
Right.
could benefit from gene therapy.
Exactly.
And then otherwise, let's just create a supportive environment where everyone can feel better. Cotton underwear for all.
Or even if it's just the timing of it, right? Like, you would never give your 4-year-old a shot of whiskey, right? Like, but
Right.
maybe one day when they're of age or whatever, and you're like, like, it'll be great to sit around and have a drink with them one day, right? To just understand that, like, certain exposures might be okay when you are older.
Right.
And so that there are certain things that we should not expose a child's immune system to. It doesn't mean you have to ban it. You could still, in theory, have nylon underwear for women, but not for girls,
Right.
right? And like, if there was a more openness, I think we both understand, like, why a business that is predicated on selling nylon underwear would not want to hear anybody float the idea of any limitation, right? But there needs to be a more honest conversation about, like, look, yeah, these are cheap and inexpensive, and here's why. Because they are made from readily available chemicals that are slag from oil refineries, and we just needed something to do with all this oil slag, so we turned it into margarine, or we turned it into, that was coal slag, or we turned it into, it used to be called coal butter.
There's nothing I like on my toast more than coal slag.
Coal butter, yeah, that's what they called it back in the original time when they invented it. And to just say, like, yeah, it's cheap, it's inexpensive, but there are side effects to that, and just to be prepared for that. And I think most people, particularly around children, would be more cautious and would want to say, like, well, no, I don't want my kid near that. Or all the money that we've spent, I would love to have spent it on better filtration systems, right? Because there's certain, we talk about the things that you could bring in your house. Some of it's beyond your control. Like we talk about with the wildfire, you could not have controlled that. But if we had state-of-the-art, or really, like, I shouldn't say state-of-the-art, future ventilation systems that could genuinely pull all these chemicals out of the air, maybe it's not so big of a deal, right? You can run inside your house or exercise or whatever. Now, there's a bigger climate conversation about the wildfires, but at least within your home, you could ventilate that and filter that. And, there's not, I guarantee you, there's not hundreds of millions of dollars flowing out into the research community to look at air filters.
Right. You hear that? Untapped potential for
Yes.
profit and research.
Right. If you are the air filter company who can prove that you genuinely pull all this stuff out of that's the only leveraging of the private sector on this that I can think of, because everything else is going against somebody who's selling a product with this in there.
Right. Well, as with all of my favorite problems, this one is deeply complex and touches so many parts of society. But I think that your book really does an incredible job of connecting so many dots and again, just using humor and data to paint this picture of, like, we're having the wrong conversation, and let's just rethink through this entire thought process and hear, like, it's like, say it out loud and hear how illogical what you're saying is. And then let's just, no hard feelings. Let's start over and have a better conversation. So I'm once again going to recommend that everyone get this book. As you can see, it's heavily highlighted and flagged for me because I read like a psychopath and I just have to always be highlighting the best lines. And in this book, there are many. So with that said, are you taking it on the road? Is there a book tour coming up? Can people come hunt you down at like a Politics and Prose, or where can people connect with you?
I don't even know how to do it. It's all self-published, and I did reach out, and maybe the topic for the next one will be the pain of seeing the publishing community's response to this. I felt like the people who will publish a book like The Genetic Lottery aren't interested in one that opposes that point of view. So I haven't had any book tour offers yet.
It's not as sexy to say
Right.
that we should maybe just have a very basic logical approach to cleaning up society.
Right.
That's not the sex appeal of like, did you know there's something deeply wrong lurking inside your genetic code?
And it's not, it doesn't give people an off-ramp, right? Because if you genuinely believe that some people just get sick, nothing we can do about it, well, then I don't have any responsibility as a politician or as a healthcare provider or as a citizen. I don't have to worry about it. If some kids just struggle in school, it's not because they're right next to the highway or they live in poverty or a million other factors that play into it. Nope, just genes matter. And we just throw that out there. Then I don't have to do anything about it. Or I can pretend that I'll vote for a politician who in theory at least speaks well about it, even if they don't actually vote well about it. And I don't know what will move the needle per se, but I have a lot of faith that in the book I talk about scientific revolutions, where they talk about how paradigms shift, and unfortunately, it's all the old people die, and then the new people come in with their new ideas. So I have a lot of faith in the younger generation that they'll take over. We'll see.
Awesome. Well, I have that faith too. And we're both raising future microbiome scientists,
That's right.
obviously,
Yep.
kombucha drinking microbiome scientists. So I do believe that the tides will turn, and this combination of the future of microbiome research and food as medicine and just understanding the role that the environment and public health play in health outcomes. This conversation is growing. It's still young. It's still complicated. It faces a lot of communication challenges and failures, but I am super grateful to know about your work. And so thank you for everything that you're doing. It comforts me to know there's someone in the NIH who's saying, hey, let's spray a bacteria on people to fix their eczema. That's awesome. That totally makes my day and my life. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for speaking with me today. It's been such a treat and a pleasure, and I really enjoyed every moment.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. For more information on me, Marian, please visit my website at marianflaxman.com. For more information on today's guest, Dr. Ian Myles, and to find a place to purchase his book, Gattaca Has Fallen, please see the links in the show notes. This episode was produced by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much once again for listening, and we will see you next time.